So just give you a sense of what I'm going to talk through. We have kind of an overview of the draft plan, a little bit about the implementation approach that we're suggesting through the plan, and then an overview of kind of the document structure and the materials that are available for public comment and feedback. So just as a quick reminder, this is really a framework plan. It's about kind of tying together a lot of different topic-specific issues and patterns and trends and really shaping, in particular, a physical and spatial and development-oriented vision for the city. And so that's really a lot of what the plan addresses, but it touches on a lot of things that kind of have tendrils into other topic-specific plans, future area-specific plans. So keep that in mind. It's not going to get into the sort of the very specific details of every neighborhood of the city, but it should provide a framework that sort of ties it all together. And it does cover quite a few topics. So it's everything from housing to transportation mobility, recreation, open space and environment, economic opportunity, culture and creativity, and services and facilities. So just with that list, you can see why we can't get into all the details, but the important thing is that all of these things are talking to one another and that they're working towards a shared goal. So the process for this plan has been a long one, which is appropriate for a citywide long-range plan like this. This has been a more or less a 2-year effort, and it's included some sort of swells of public engagement and input around sort of the initial needs and opportunity sort of identification, the visioning, and then subsequently around the draft recommendations and sort of the spatial recommendations that sort of coincide with the written recommendations. So you can see the details of that process here. I'm not going to go through every piece of it, but you can see that there's quite a bit that's gone into this. And so this reflects all of the sort of synthesized input from both the analysis and from what we heard from the public and stakeholders around the city. So to give you kind of the basics of the framework of the plan, including kind of the spatial component, which is embedded in the growth framework and the future land use vision, I'm just going to kind of walk through a couple slides here to give you a foundation in these. And this is obviously addressed in much more detail in the plan document. So the framework of the plan is oriented around a series of guiding principles that have a lot of overlap with the strategic plan that the city did a few years back, as well as Green Worcester and a couple of other recent planning efforts. So these shouldn't come to as a surprise for anyone. They're values that a lot of planning processes share. We're looking to use this planning process to bring about equity, resilience, inclusivity, integrity, and innovation. You can see kind of specifically what we mean by those on the slides here, which will be available for the public afterwards. And our vision statement is really informed by those guiding principles and what we heard from folks from the outset. So this is something that we've gone over in a couple different settings, so I'm not going to read it out here, but you'll see that kind of threaded through in the details of the plan recommendations that I'll spend a little bit more time on today. So one of the sort of critical organizing features of the plan are these plan headlines. These are really themes that emerged from the engagement in particular that really are what the rest of the plan ties back into across lots of different topics. And so the idea is that these three are really unifying things that can help you understand the much more detailed individual components of the plan. So the first is that this plan is intended to provide a values-centered framework for growth that benefits all community members of Worcester. So it's really important that this plan is really laying out a way that Worcester can grow that can help to achieve all these other associated goals. We also heard loud and clear that there was an interest in equitable public investment in Worcester's neighborhoods.
This meeting is being recorded.
And that's something that is not sort of to the exclusion of continued investment in downtown and the Canal District, but rather sort of supplementing that, extending that kind of intention and sort of coordinated efforts out in particular into like neighborhood corridors and centers that really have a relationship to that downtown core and serve as sort of gathering spaces and important economic development and sort of services hubs for Worcester's many neighborhoods. And then last but not least, we heard a lot of interest in this plan helping to bring about a more connected and accessible city for all. So that's really talking specifically about transportation and mobility, but it goes beyond that a little bit. But the idea here is that, a successful sort of citywide long-range plan really needs to knit together land use and transportation, and people need to be able to get around the city in lots of different ways for that all to work. So there's a lot of specifics there, but that's kind of the idea behind these three themes. And again, they came through really strongly in public engagement, and were also supported by the analysis that we did separately. So each of those are kind of threaded through, they cut across a lot of different topic areas. So you'll see them in like housing, you'll see them in transportation mobility, in culture and creativity. There's a lot of different touch points for these, but you see here highlighted some of the top kind of ideas about how we might be able to advance these headlines or these themes that came through public engagement. And I'm not going to read through all of these. Excuse me, I'm recovering from a cold, so my voice might come in and out a little bit. But you can see kind of these items really come through when we circle back towards the end of this presentation and the end of the plan document in terms of our early action priorities for advancing implementation of this plan. A lot of these items are reflected in that sort of top 6 that we'll talk about at the end. So the next piece that is a really important component of this plan is the growth framework. So that's really specifically speaking to that first plan headline, as this plan is tasked with setting out what that growth framework looks like for the city. And that's the foundation for a lot of different efforts, both infrastructure and capital investments, as well as land use and zoning, and planning for development outcomes in particular. So this doesn't come out of nowhere. This comes from a sort of a trend that has held true for Worcester for the last decade of significant growth. And looking forward through a couple of different kind of projection methods, we were able to kind of zero in on a potential envelope of kind of what kind of growth Worcester might need to plan for going forward. This is not a prediction of what will happen, but rather a reasonable set of expectations about what could happen and how Worcester can prepare for it. So we're looking at, up to 60,000 new residents could be coming to Worcester by 2040. And that translates into roughly 20,000 new units of multifamily housing that would be needed to support those new residents. So that's one of the kind of driving components of why we feel like a growth framework is important for Worcester right now, is knowing where and how that growth should occur in the city and really shaping that growth and not just letting it happen to Worcester. So this is we're going to look at a map in just a moment that'll show these ideas, but I wanted to introduce the way that the plan sort of presents degrees of change or kind of types of growth that we're talking about in different parts of the city. So the idea is that in aggregate, these really are able to provide a way that growth can be directed and sort of shaped such that it is helping to achieve all of the many goals that we heard from people throughout the planning process. So the first is transformative growth areas. These are places where we'd like to see the city facilitate significant reinvestment and physical transformation in areas with unmet potential for high walkability and transit access. And these are areas that could really support substantial job growth and or higher density housing and complementary commercial uses. And these are places that really will require some effort to kind of meet that potential, both in terms of planning as well as sort of infrastructure and service investments like transportation mobility issues, utilities, things like that, in order to be able to support the kind of the potential growth that they could see and they could kind of serve for the city as a whole. The next category is infill growth areas. These are places that in most cases already have mixed use development, but that are places where you could encourage increased or additional mixed use development on vacant or underutilized properties in existing areas with high walkability and transit access. So it's sort of building on what's there already and helping to sort of supplement and grow that sort of existing pattern. And then last but not least, or actually kind of second to last but not least, is managed growth areas. These are Places where we could allow for moderate increases in housing density. There are areas that are within a quarter mile of walking distance from both existing and potential future transit corridors. And then the actual final kind of category here, which is not mapped per se, is just that there's a certain degree of growth that the city as a whole should be supporting, even in areas outside of these kind of designated focus areas. And so that's an important kind of baseline to support the overall growth needs of the city. So enough of the talking. Here's the map of those areas. I'm highlighting here in blue the transformative growth areas, in the darker red, infill growth areas, and then at the sort of pale red or pink buffers that you see around the major street corridors for the most part. Those are the managed growth areas that I was talking about. Those are listed out here in detail. I'm not going to read them all off, but you can see that they're kind of distributed throughout the city and have different sort of qualities to them in terms of their shape and their characteristics. So that's an important piece of the plan overall. But it's also important to note that not all of these, transformative growth areas or infill growth areas have the same kind of potentials or the same characteristics. They're each unique to their location, of course. And beyond that, they also have different kind of land use potentials. So what we're talking about here is not a sort of prescriptive set of land uses, but rather sort of a broader vision for the type of land use mix that might be the best fit for these areas. And so the idea is that these are encouraging mutually beneficial mixes of uses that are compatible or complementary to one another. So you can think of, for instance, housing and retail help to kind of serve one another. Oftentimes, people who look close by would love to go to a retail or service provider that's close to where they live. In other situations, there's a need for some protections or separation buffering between uses that might not mix as well. So the classic example here is housing versus sort of a higher impact or sort of bigger scale industrial use. You'd want to have a little bit of space between those so for them both to be able to operate optimally. So to give you a sense of the categories that we've used here, mixed use is kind of a catch-all for that sort of classic sort of neighborhood center and corridor, things that have active commercial ground floors, anything from retail and entertainment to services like banking, barbers, dry cleaning. And then that has, typically a complementary kind of upper floor use of either residential or office or some mix of the two. And there's lots of variation in that, but that's sort of a broad category that encompasses a lot of these growth areas. Another more focused one is life science. This is really to support healthcare providers, scientific research, and development lab uses. And this has, there's some specific dimensional and use needs of this category. And so it pairs well with retail, commercial, hotels, educational institutions, and limited residential. And then artisan has some similar characteristics. This is kind of, you might think of kind of older industrial areas often are well suited to this mix. So for smaller, lower impact creative producers that might not have the same needs as sort of large scale industrial uses, things like fashion, furniture, food and beverage companies that have some production needs, but they're more compatible with things like retail, commercial, hotels, and residential. And then finally, industrial areas. This is an important part of any economy in any city. Is larger producers, distributors. These are ones that are typically dependent on trucks and larger kind of transportation infrastructure, and often need larger footprints and benefit from a little bit of buffering from residential uses, but might still have some limited retail and commercial that serves kind of area employers and employees. So you can see that kind of mapped on here. So this is focused on just the transformative growth areas and the infill growth areas. We're articulating this kind of use vision. And I'm gesturing because I have my slides up here on the right. So apologies if that's a little incongruous for you seeing the slide deck on your own. So you can see here that we have these categorized in terms of mixed use, which is, again, the vast majority of these areas. Life science, which is more kind of a limited focus around WPI area, the reactor biomanufacturing park, and to a lesser extent, there's some potential also in the Canal District for that. And then artisan, again, a smaller set there just for kind of areas that we've highlighted that could have a beneficial use as kind of an artisan use mix. And then just 3 that are kind of a great fit for more traditional industrial producers and distributors that can be a focus of further development in that space. And it's important to note this is not, to the exclusion of existing uses that are there. It's more about kind of shaping the evolution of these districts over time and allowing for that evolution in a way that makes sense for the city and for the people that are there already. So that's kind of the core of the plan recommendations. Again, there's much, much more detail in the plan document, but that gives you kind of a flavor of the key items that this plan is describing and giving sort of shape to. So with that, I want to give you a little bit of a flavor of the kind of approach to prioritization and the sort of the top priority early actions that really rose out of the process that we had to kind of review all of these recommendations with the public and with stakeholders and internally within the city. So you'll see here there's 6 items that are listed. They're listed not in terms of priority, but roughly in terms of the expected sequence of implementation based on kind of what's underway already, et cetera. So the mobility action plan, this is something that it was initiated kind of partway through this process and really is a critical step to bring that next level of specificity to the mobility and transportation investments throughout the city and to shape kind of the plan for the Department of Transportation and Mobility, which was newly created about partway through, midway through the planning process for Worcester Now Next. And the idea is that this will give, more prioritize, identify, and give more specific capital, operational, and programmatic projects that can advance safe, equitable, and sustainable transportation in Worcester. So that's underway, and it's listed sort of first because it's expected to complete in the near future and would be kind of moving into implementation. The next category here is pre-overhaul zoning changes. So these are what you could think of as kind of low-hanging fruit, things that can be addressed in a more focused or limited way in advance of a zoning overhaul, which is something that for most communities, a citywide long-range plan like this one is really a stepping stone to preparing for a zoning overhaul. And so these are just 3 items that we think can kind of be handled in advance of that. The first is legalizing accessory dwelling units, ADUs, citywide with dimensional standards. That has already actually been advanced, moved through the adoption process and is now in effect, as I understand. The second is a reduction or elimination of off-street minimum parking requirements for most uses to reflect Worcester's urban environment. So that's not saying a blanket, elimination, but rather, a focused elimination or reduction in the areas where it's most needed. And then last of these kind of pre-overhaul zoning changes, implementing reform to the requirements that protect tree canopy on existing lots to reduce tree removals. It's something that hits on a lot of different sustainability, health, and sort of climate resilience goals, and it's something that sits within the development regulations for the city. So that's kind of the first 2 there. A third is developing a housing production plan. That's sort of in a similar vein to the mobility action plan. That would be taking the housing kind of needs and priorities that emerged through the engagement in this process and getting them to the next level of detail. And that's something that would be able to, for instance, identify the types of housing that are most needed and how to prioritize those based on things like demographic trends, projections, et cetera. And this is something that was funded already by a straight grant. It's not underway yet, but it's already funded and sort of in the sort of work plan going forward. The next piece is kind of a pivot point. It's really critical that there's kind of the appropriate level of staff capacity as well as resources to take on a lot of the initiatives that have emerged through this planning process. And so that requires, in particular within the Executive Office of Economic Development and its External Services Department, some additional capacity to sort of take on the leadership of these initiatives. So that's kind of a pivot point between those first 3 that can be kind of accomplished within existing staffing and resources versus the 5 and 6 here, which will require kind of an additional level of effort that would benefit from that or is contingent upon that additional capacity. So for number 5, the infrastructure capacity need assessments, that's really about doing the work to confirm the existing capacity, what needs there are, what demands there are on things like utilities, stormwater, electric, sewer infrastructure, so that there's a clear sense of what's needed in order to support the growth that Worcester is expecting at this point. And then last, but certainly not least, this is really in some ways the primary kind of outcome of this is initiating and completing a citywide zoning overhaul to really, not only align Worcester zoning with the growth framework and land use vision that has been articulated through this process, but also to address some other kind of more kind of ongoing issues like creating a more user-friendly digital and visual zoning code that has more kind of consistent outcomes and predictable outcomes for folks, both developers and property owners, as well as residents and community members. And it also includes things like, addressing some of the aspects of the current zoning code that have been contributing to or reinforcing either exclusionary or kind of, segregation, things that have been negatively impacting certain parts of the Worcester community and need to be addressed within the zoning code. So you see those kind of listed in brief on the left here. The idea is that those would be the focus for the next 3 to 5 years, but that once those are completed, the kind of more complete list of recommendations should be revisited and sort of prioritized at that time with sort of the latest information and sort of engagement input that is available at that time. And then that throughout the sort of implementation, as this shifts from being kind of a planning process to being a document, a reference document for the city going forward, the idea is that this would be used as a guide to evaluate projects as well as a kind of reference to look for alignment between future planning efforts and this one to confirm that it's all syncing up. And that there be kind of an idea of annual sort of informal staff reporting to the planning board to share progress on the plan implementation process as a way to kind of keep that in people's minds and provide some accountability and awareness of the implementation process. Last but not least here, we have included at the end of the report a series of indicators that are intended to provide an opportunity or a way of thinking about kind of monitoring and sort of tracking trends that relate to the core recommendations and vision of this plan. These are not intended to be, explicit, success metrics, but rather kind of monitoring metrics. And it's important to note this would be resource intensive to do that tracking. And so it's something that, while it provides a value, would have to be kind of contingent on having the staff available to do that. Okay, and I realize I'm just about at the 20-minute mark here, so I'm gonna wrap up pretty quickly here. So an overview of the draft plan document. It's sort of organized in 3 sections. There's an introduction that includes kind of some opening matter acknowledgements, an opening letter from the city manager, Eric Batista, and an executive summary that provides a kind of a high-level overview of the entire plan, similar to the presentation I'm sharing with you tonight. An introduction which really covers the kind of the process in particular and how to use the plan document. Worcester Now is intended to provide an overview of patterns, trends, aspects of Worcester's history and Worcester's sort of geography that contribute to an understanding of the place and the people that animate Worcester and some of the issues that maybe remain to be addressed in a plan like this one. Worcester Next is the recommendations of the plan from sort of soup to nuts. So it includes the plan headlines we went over together today, as well as the growth framework. It also includes a series of topic-specific policy guides with goals and recommendations by each topic area. And last but not least, a more detailed implementation section that covers some of the issues I just talked through with you all. That content is all expressed in a couple of different settings. So we have a brief flyer that's intended largely as an outreach tool, communication tool to get people aware of the existence of the draft plan and encourage people to provide input. We have an executive summary that has been translated into the top 8 Worcester languages, as has the flyer. And then we have the full draft plan document, which is a 150-page document or so. So that's a much more detailed and extensive review. The executive summary, by contrast, is about 4 pages or so in total. So a much more, I think it's actually maybe climbing to like 6 or so. So a much briefer overview. The translation, as I mentioned, the flyer and executive summary are both in the top 8 languages. The draft plan public comment form is in both English and Spanish. And you can print it directly from the project website or reach out to the city. Public comment will be open through February 25th, and that's largely funneled through our online public comment form, which can also be printed and shared in an in-person or sort of analog way. And that's all, again, available online at nownext.worcesterma.gov, and it's under the documents section of the webpage. Okay, next steps. So as I mentioned, public comment period is open, and we'll be taking comments through February 25th. Our target for adoption is March 20th. We might do that a little bit earlier if we're able to. And we'll also be producing an area plan template that will be a tool for the city going forward to begin to do more local area plans in neighborhoods and districts around the city that we'll be able to relate back to and tie into the framework of Worcester Now Next.